The city was alive with its usual morning chaos, honking cars, rushing pedestrians, and the distant wail of sirens blending into the symphony of urban life. No one paid attention to the lone figure that shuffled onto Main Street, its movements slow and disjointed, as if struggling to remember how to walk. It was a man, at least, he looked like one. His clothes were tattered, stained with something dark and crusted. His face was pale, lips cracked, and his vacant eyes darted around without recognition. His right arm hung limply, twisted at an unnatural angle, but he moved forward regardless, driven by an unknown force. The first person to notice him was a street vendor, a middle-aged man selling coffee and bagels from a cart on the corner. He wrinkled his nose at the sight of the disheveled man approaching, shaking his head. Another homeless junkie, he thought. The city was full of them. "You all right there, buddy?" he asked casually, pouring a fresh cup of coffee. The man didn't respond. He simply stood there, head tilted, as if studying the vendor. Then, without warning, he lurched forward. "Hey, back off," the vendor snapped, stepping away. But the man didn't stop. His mouth opened slightly, revealing gums that were blackened, teeth chipped and yellowed. His breath reeked of something rotten, something worse than mere decay. The vendor grabbed a napkin and waved it in front of his nose. "Damn, man, you smell like..." The man lunged. With inhuman strength, he grabbed the vendor's arm and bit down, his teeth sinking deep into flesh. The vendor screamed, the sound piercing through the morning air. People turned. Some gasped. Others pulled out their phones, ready to record what looked like a drugged-out attack. The vendor fell backward, clutching his arm as blood spilled onto the pavement. The attacker didn't stop. He chewed, swallowing a piece of flesh, his vacant eyes locked onto the next nearest person, a woman in business attire, frozen in horror. The crowd reacted too late. A young man in a hoodie ran forward, trying to push the attacker off the vendor. The thing turned, grabbed him by the throat, and sank its teeth into his cheek, tearing away a chunk of skin. The young man's screams were muffled by the thick, wet sound of flesh being ripped apart. The street erupted into chaos. People ran in different directions, screaming. A police officer stationed near the bus stop sprinted toward the scene, drawing his baton. "Get away from him," the officer shouted. The attacker didn't react. He simply turned toward the cop, his face now glistening with fresh blood. The officer hesitated. Something was wrong. He had seen violence before, drugged-out lunatics, desperate criminals, but this wasn't normal. The attacker didn't seem to feel pain, didn't even acknowledge the baton the officer slammed into his ribs. When the officer finally pulled his gun, it was too late. The attacker lunged again, knocking him to the ground with unnatural strength. The gun skidded across the pavement, lost in the chaos. More screams. More blood. And then, something even worse happened. The vendor, the young man, and another bystander who had been bitten all convulsed violently on the ground. Their bodies twitched, spasmed, and then, they stopped moving. For a moment, there was silence, except for the distant sirens approaching. Then, one by one, the corpses twitched again. Limbs bent unnaturally as they slowly pulled themselves up. The vendor, whose throat had been torn open, let out a soft, gurgling groan. His eyes, once brown and full of life, had turned a milky, soulless white. The young man, his cheek missing, turned his head in jerky, robotic movements. His lips curled back, revealing bloody teeth, and his hands clawed at the air like a newborn testing its limbs for the first time. The police officer, lying motionless just moments ago, sat up abruptly. His eyes, too, had changed. His mouth opened unnaturally wide, as if learning how to use it again. The infection had spread. A woman screamed from across the street. A businessman dropped his phone and ran. A car, in its panic, swerved onto the sidewalk, knocking over pedestrians before crashing into a lamppost. The city was still waking up, unaware that something monstrous had already begun. And the first zombie, the one who started it all, just kept walking, unnoticed in the growing chaos. The city barely had time to react before the infection spread like wildfire. Emergency responders arrived at the scene, but confusion and disbelief clouded their judgment. Officers attempted to restrain the attacker, only to realize too late that bullets didn't stop him, not unless they hit the head. EMTs rushed to help the wounded, unaware that the bitten weren't just dying, they were changing. Detective Alan Carter had seen his fair share of violent incidents. Stabbings, shootings, gang fights, none of it fazed him anymore. But what he saw when he arrived on Main Street sent a chill through his bones. The scene was absolute carnage. Blood painted the pavement in thick, dark smears. A few bodies lay still, but others, they were moving. An officer fired a shot. A woman in a torn dress collapsed to the ground, twitching violently. Alan turned to see what was happening, and froze. She wasn't just twitching. She was getting back up. A gunshot to the chest should have been fatal, but she moved as if nothing had happened. Her head jerked toward the nearest bystander, a man too slow to react. She lunged at him, teeth sinking deep into his throat. The man's screams were cut short as blood sprayed in an arc. Alan pulled his own weapon. Jesus Christ! A voice crackled through his radio. All units, we have multiple violent assaults downtown. Reports indicate static. Biting? Dispatch, what the hell is happening? Alan didn't wait for an answer. He took aim at the woman, but before he could fire, another officer grabbed his arm. Carter, what the hell are you doing? That's a civilian. Alan looked at him. Does that look like a civilian to you? The officer hesitated. The woman, still chewing on the flesh of her latest victim, turned toward them. Her lips curled back in a grotesque snarl, and she sprinted forward with unnatural speed. Alan didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. This time, he aimed for the head. The bullet tore through her skull, and she dropped instantly. No twitching. No getting back up. Just silence. Alan exhaled sharply. Headshots work. The other officer, pale and shaken, took a step back. What the hell are these things? Before Alan could answer, another scream rang out. Across the street, more people were collapsing. Some from injuries. Some for no apparent reason at all. And then, just like before, they started moving again. Meanwhile, in a small diner 2 blocks away, Emma Reynolds sipped her coffee and scrolled through her phone. She had no idea what was happening outside. The morning had been normal. She had just finished her night shift at the hospital and was looking forward to getting home, taking a long shower, and collapsing into bed. The news playing on the diner's old TV barely registered in her mind, something about a violent incident near Main Street. She yawned, stretching in her seat, when she noticed something strange outside the window. A man covered in blood stumbled past, his head twitching violently. His movements were unnatural, jerky, like a puppet with its strings tangled. No one stopped to help him. Most people were too focused on their phones or their morning routines. Then, a second figure appeared. A woman, dragging herself along the sidewalk. Her arm hung limply, bone poking through torn skin. And yet, she didn't cry out in pain. Emma frowned. Something was wrong. The TV volume increased. Authorities have yet to comment, but reports suggest that the attackers are highly aggressive in. A loud crash. Emma whipped her head toward the window. A taxi had just slammed into a fire hydrant, sending water spraying into the air. The driver stumbled out, his face twisted in agony. He clutched his shoulder, where a deep, ragged bite mark oozed blood. Emma's stomach dropped. The man took a few steps before collapsing onto the pavement. People rushed toward him, shouting for someone to call 911. Emma was about to get up and help, her instincts as a nurse kicking in, when the man's body twitched. Then, to her horror, he sat up. His eyes were wrong. Lifeless. Milky white. Then, without hesitation, he grabbed the nearest person and bit down hard. Screams erupted. Emma's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. Panic spread like wildfire. People in the diner rushed toward the exit, knocking over chairs and tables. The waitress behind the counter gasped, stepping backward, her hand over her mouth. Emma didn't move. She couldn't. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The man, who had been dead just seconds ago, was now attacking anyone who got too close. And worse, the people he bit, they were starting to change too. Emma's heart pounded. She needed to move. She needed to get out of here. But it was already too late. A shadow fell over the diner window. Another figure stood outside. Then another. They weren't just in the street anymore. They were everywhere. And they were coming. The outbreak spread faster than anyone could react. By the time emergency broadcasts interrupted television programs, it was already too late. Downtown was a war zone. Sirens wailed, car alarms blared, and panicked screams filled the air. The infection jumped from street to street, home to home. Anyone bitten turned within minutes. The city, once alive with morning commuters and shoppers, had transformed into a nightmare. And at Westwood Mall, hundreds of people were about to be trapped in the middle of it. Westwood Mall, 11:45 a.m. The food court was packed with lunchtime crowds, shoppers, workers on break, and teenagers skipping school. The scent of fried food and coffee filled the air as people laughed, chatted, and scrolled through their phones. No one noticed the bloodied man stumbling through the entrance until it was too late. He collapsed near the main fountain, gasping, his skin pale and clammy. A woman in a store uniform rushed forward. "Sir, are you okay?" The man twitched violently. His breathing stopped. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone called 911. A security guard pushed his way through, one hand hovering over his radio. Then, the man moved. He lunged, grabbing the woman's arm and sinking his teeth into her wrist. Her scream echoed through the food court. The crowd froze. The security guard cursed, grabbing his baton. "Hey! Let her go!" The attacker didn't respond. He tore into the woman's flesh, shaking his head like a rabid animal. Blood splattered across the tiles. Then, as suddenly as he had collapsed, the woman went limp. The crowd screamed. People shoved and tripped over chairs, knocking over trays of food as they scrambled for the exits. The security guard pulled the attacker off the woman and shoved him to the ground. "Stay down." But the attacker didn't stay down. Despite taking a baton strike to the ribs, he got up. His body moved in jerky, unnatural motions, his head twitching side to side. The woman on the floor gasped suddenly. Then, her body convulsed. Before the guard could react, she sat up. Her once bright eyes were now milky white. Her lips curled back, revealing bloody teeth. She lunged. The guard barely had time to scream before she bit into his throat. Blood sprayed across the white tiles. Then, chaos erupted. The outbreak spreads. By the time the first gunshot rang out, fired by an off-duty cop trying to stop the spreading infection, dozens of people were already bitten. The mall became a death trap. At game point, a group of teenagers watched in horror as people ran past the store, some covered in blood, others already turning. "What the hell is happening?" one of them whispered. Then, one of the employees locked the gate. "Get inside, now!" At Megamart, a father grabbed his daughter and bolted toward the emergency exit, but the doors were locked. He banged his fist against them. "Open! Open the damn doors!" Behind him, more screams. He turned to see a horde of people sprinting in his direction, not running away, but toward them, their faces twisted with hunger. At the shoe rack, an employee tried to barricade the store, dragging display racks in front of the entrance. A woman banged on the glass. "Let me in. Please." Behind her, a figure sprinted out of nowhere and tackled her to the ground. The employee backed away, covering her mouth as the woman's screams faded into gurgles. It was happening too fast. People who had been shopping for clothes, eating lunch, or just walking through the mall were now running, screaming, or worse, attacking each other. Security tried to intervene, but nothing worked. Tasers had no effect. Bullets only stopped them with a direct shot to the head. And there were too many of them. Emma's desperate escape. Emma Reynolds had made it to Westwood Mall just before the chaos erupted. She had been trying to get home after witnessing the first wave of attacks downtown, but the streets were clogged with panicked traffic and wrecked cars. Her mistake was thinking the mall would be safe. Now, she was trapped. She had barely stepped inside when she saw the blood. She had barely processed the screaming when she saw the dead rising. A woman sprinted past her, sobbing. "They're everywhere. They're..." She didn't finish her sentence. Something grabbed her from behind and pulled her to the ground. Emma turned and ran. She weaved through the chaos, past the food court, dodging panicked shoppers. A man ran in front of her, only to be tackled from the side. His screams didn't last long. Heart pounding, Emma spotted the escalator. If she could make it to the second floor, she might have a chance. She sprinted. Behind her, more people were turning. More bodies twitched, sat up, and changed. She reached the escalator and leaped over a fallen body. The mechanical steps carried her upward as chaos unfolded below. At the top, she looked down. It was a massacre. Zombies tore into the living. People who had been friends, family, co-workers, were now attacking each other, biting, tearing. The infection had taken over. Emma turned, chest heaving. She needed to find a way out. Then she heard something. A voice. "Hey! Over here!" She spun toward the sound. A group of survivors, 5 or 6 people, were huddled near a boarded-up storefront. A young man in a leather jacket waved at her. "Hurry!" Emma didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward them just as the first zombies started climbing the escalator behind her. As she reached the group, the young man yanked her inside. The metal gate slammed shut behind her. Emma collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Outside, the undead swarmed the mall, spreading like wildfire. The world had changed in a matter of minutes. And now, she was trapped inside. Westwood Mall was lost. The infection had spread too fast, and by the time the first police reinforcements arrived, the building had become a feeding ground for the undead. But the horror didn't stop there. The entire city was falling. Fire and smoke choked the skyline as explosions rocked the streets. Sirens wailed endlessly, but they were quickly drowned out by the deafening screams of the dying and the inhuman groans of the undead. This was no longer an outbreak. This was an apocalypse. Emergency broadcast, 12:30 p.m. Across the city, televisions, radios, and cell phones buzzed with the same chilling message. This is an emergency alert from the National Safety Bureau. Citizens are advised to stay indoors and avoid all contact with infected individuals. Law enforcement is working to contain the situation. Do not attempt to engage with the infected. Remain in your homes. Stay safe. The broadcast repeated in an automated loop, but it was already useless. There were no safe homes anymore. Downtown, 1 p.m. Detective Alan Carter wiped blood from his face, his gun trembling in his grip. He had fired too many shots, but it didn't matter. The streets were crawling with the dead. Cars sat abandoned in the middle of intersections, their doors flung open as people had tried to flee. Bodies littered the sidewalks, some still twitching as they changed. The air was thick with smoke from a burning gas station nearby. Flames reflected in the dead eyes of the horde staggering toward him. Alan took a step back, reloading his last magazine. His radio crackled. "Officer down. They're everywhere. We need..." Static. Alan cursed under his breath. He had tried to keep order, tried to protect civilians. But there was no order left. The city was gone. A guttural growl snapped his attention back to the horde. The nearest zombie, a woman in a tattered business suit, reached for him. Her fingers were broken, nails torn, but her hunger was endless. Alan raised his gun. Click. Empty. The woman lunged. Alan barely managed to shove her away before turning and sprinting down an alley. His heart pounded in his ears. He needed to find shelter. He needed to survive. The survivors in the mall. Inside Westwood Mall, Emma and the small group of survivors listened as gunshots and screams echoed from outside. A middle-aged man, bald and sweating, paced back and forth. "We're screwed. We're so damn screwed." Emma tightened her grip on a metal pipe she had found. She was still shaking from what she had witnessed, but fear wouldn't help her now. "Panicking won't do us any good," she said. The young man in the leather jacket, Lucas, leaned against the wall. "She's right. We need a plan. We can't stay here forever." A woman with a torn sleeve clutched her arm. "Where do we even go? The streets are worse than in here." Emma swallowed hard. She didn't have an answer. Then, from outside the gate, came a slow, rhythmic pounding. Thud. 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 Shadows moved beyond the barricade. The undead had found them. Lucas cursed. "We don't have much time." Emma took a deep breath. She looked at the others. "Then we get out of here before they break through." No one argued. Because there was no other choice. The fall of the city. By 3 p.m., entire neighborhoods had been wiped out. The National Guard had been deployed, but even they struggled to contain the outbreak. Blockades were torn apart. Checkpoints were overrun. Soldiers who had sworn to protect the city were now part of the horde. Fires raged through downtown. Explosions shook the skyline. The city was no longer a place of the living. It belonged to the dead. And the nightmare was just beginning. The city had become a graveyard. The once busy streets were now overrun with the dead, their guttural moans echoing between burning buildings. Smoke and ash choked the sky. Sirens had long since gone silent, replaced by the horrifying sounds of flesh being torn, of desperate screams that never lasted long. Survivors were scattered, forced into hiding, searching for any place that could offer even a moment of safety. But in a world where the dead walked, nowhere was safe. Escape from the mall. Emma gritted her teeth as she helped push a heavy clothing rack in front of the gate. The undead outside pounded against it, their decayed hands reaching through the gaps. Thud. 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 The metal rattled, threatening to give way at any moment. "We need to go," Lucas shouted, gripping his crowbar. "That's not gonna hold forever." The bald man, Terry, wiped sweat from his forehead. "Go where? You saw what's out there. The streets are a death trap." A woman named Riley, her arm wrapped in a torn sleeve, looked toward the back of the store. "There's a loading dock. Maybe we can get out through there." Emma nodded. "It's better than waiting to die in here." Lucas didn't wait for further discussion. He led the way through the store, the others close behind. The pounding on the gate grew louder, more urgent. Then, with a deafening clang, the barricade gave way. The dead poured in. "Run!" Emma screamed. They sprinted through the stockroom, shoving past shelves and broken displays. Lucas kicked open the emergency exit, and they stumbled into the alley behind the mall. Only to find that they weren't alone. A group of zombies, drawn by the noise, turned their lifeless eyes toward them. "Shit!" Terry cursed. Emma swung her metal pipe, smashing it into the skull of the nearest undead. It cracked, but the creature still reached for her. Lucas buried his crowbar into another's head, yanking it free as blood splattered onto his jacket. "There's a truck." Riley pointed. At the end of the alley, a delivery truck sat abandoned. Its back doors were slightly open. They ran for it. Terry climbed in first, reaching back to pull Emma inside. Lucas followed, shoving Riley in just as a zombie lunged at them. He barely managed to slam the doors shut before the creatures swarmed the truck, their rotten hands slapping against the metal. Inside, the survivors gasped for breath. For now, they were safe. But for how long? Detective Carter's last stand. Across town, Alan Carter was running out of time. He had made it to the police station, hoping to find other officers, but what he found instead was hell. The front doors were shattered, the floors soaked in blood. Bodies of fellow officers littered the halls, some half-eaten, others twitching as they turned. He had barricaded himself inside the armory, but the undead were clawing at the door. He could hear their nails scraping against the metal, their moans growing louder. He checked his ammunition. 3 bullets left. His radio crackled. "Is anyone out there? This is Officer Daniels. We're trapped at the hospital. We need help." Static. Alan exhaled. He could stay here and die, or he could fight. Gritting his teeth, he reloaded his weapon, kicked open the door, and started shooting. The city burns. By nightfall, the skyline was unrecognizable. Buildings collapsed as fires raged unchecked. Explosions echoed through the streets as abandoned cars burned, casting eerie shadows against the crumbling remains of civilization. Survivors fought desperately for shelter. Some made it to rooftops, watching helplessly as the city fell beneath them. Others tried to escape by car, only to find roads jammed with wreckage and the undead. And some simply gave up. The military had set up one final evacuation point at the stadium, but rumors spread that it was already overrun. Hope was slipping away. For Emma, Lucas, and the others inside the delivery truck, one thing was clear. They couldn't stay. They had to keep moving. Because the nightmare wasn't ending. It was just getting started. The city was no longer a place for the living. The streets were overrun, buildings crumbled under raging fires, and the moans of the undead echoed endlessly. Survivors had only 2 choices, hide or die. But hiding wouldn't last forever. For Emma, Lucas, and the others trapped inside the delivery truck, time was running out. The undead surrounded them, their rotting hands clawing at the metal doors, their guttural growls growing louder. They had to move. But where? There was nowhere left to run. A desperate plan. Inside the truck, the survivors sat in tense silence. The undead slammed against the sides, their hunger relentless. Terry wiped sweat from his brow. "We're screwed. There's no way out." Lucas gritted his teeth. "No, there's a way. We just have to be smart about it." Emma clenched her fists. "Then think fast. We don't have much time." Riley, still clutching her injured arm, took a shaky breath. "What about the military? I heard there's an evacuation at the stadium." Terry scoffed. "And I heard it's overrun. You really want to take that chance?" Emma thought for a moment. The stadium. It was the only lead they had. And if the military was still there, they had a shot at survival. She made her decision. "We go to the stadium." Lucas nodded. "Then let's get out of here before we end up like them." Breaking out. The problem was simple, they were surrounded. Lucas peeked through the small opening in the back doors. "There's at least 30 of them." Terry groaned. "Great. We're gonna die." Emma ignored him. Her eyes darted to the driver's seat. "If we can get to the front and start the truck, we can ram our way through." Lucas grinned. "Now that's a plan." They inched toward the front of the truck, careful not to make too much noise. Lucas reached for the driver's door. A hand smashed against the window. A rotting face appeared, snarling, its milky eyes locking onto them. Riley screamed. The undead outside went into a frenzy, slamming their bodies against the truck. "Go! Now!" Emma yelled. Lucas yanked the door open and shoved the zombie away. Emma climbed into the passenger seat as Lucas hot-wired the ignition. The truck roared to life. The undead swarmed. Lucas slammed his foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, plowing through the horde. Bodies crunched under the tires as the vehicle burst onto the street, leaving the swarm behind. They were free. For now. The road to hell. The city was worse than they had imagined. As the truck sped through the streets, they saw the devastation up close. Bodies lined the sidewalks, some still twitching as they turned. Fires raged uncontrolled. Police cars sat abandoned, their sirens still blaring. The occasional gunshot rang out in the distance, other survivors, still fighting, still losing. And the worst part? The further they drove, the fewer living people they saw. Terry swallowed hard. We're really the only ones left, huh? Emma didn't answer. Because she didn't want to admit he was right. Ambush at the bridge. As they neared the stadium, a massive blockade came into view. Military trucks, sandbags, and barbed wire blocked the road. Lucas slowed the truck. What do we do? Before Emma could respond, a gunshot rang out. The windshield shattered. Ambush! Terry shouted. A group of survivors, armed, desperate, rushed out from behind abandoned cars. They weren't here to help. They were here to take. A man with a rifle pointed at them. Out of the truck! Now! Emma's blood ran cold. They had fought so hard to survive. And now? They might die at the hands of the living instead of the dead. Because in a world like this, people were just as dangerous as the undead. Emma's heart pounded as she stared down the barrel of the rifle. The undead were terrifying, but these people, their own kind, might be even worse. Survivors had turned on each other. Food, weapons, transportation, everything was a resource to be taken. And Emma's group had something these desperate people wanted, a working truck. Step out, the man with the rifle ordered, his voice cold. His people, 5 of them, all armed, spread out, blocking any escape. Lucas clenched his jaw. We don't want trouble. The gunman smirked. Too bad. Trouble just found you. The city was falling apart, but the real nightmare? The enemy wasn't just the undead. It was the living. A standoff in the streets. The truck's engine rumbled, the only sound in the tense silence. Emma's fingers tightened around the metal pipe in her hands. Lucas, next to her, gripped his crowbar. Riley winced as she shifted, her injured arm still bleeding. The leader of the ambushers, tall, scruffy, with a scar running across his cheek, tilted his head. We need that truck. So, you got 2 choices. Walk away, or we shoot you and take it anyway. Terry, sweating, whispered, let's just get out. Let them have it. Lucas shot him a glare. And then what? Walk to the stadium? Emma's mind raced. They were outnumbered. Outgunned. If they fought, someone would die. She had to think fast. There's not enough gas, she lied, keeping her voice steady. We barely made it this far. Scarface narrowed his eyes. Yeah? Let's check. He motioned for one of his men to move forward. Lucas acted instantly. Before the thug could reach the truck, Lucas swung his crowbar. The man collapsed, blood pouring from his skull. Run! Emma screamed. Chaos exploded. Gunfire erupted as the survivors dived for cover. Bullets whizzed past Emma's head as she sprinted behind an abandoned car. Lucas ducked low, throwing a knife he had hidden in his jacket, hitting one of the attackers in the throat. Terry, panicking, raised his hands. Wait! Stop! We surrender. A bullet ripped through his chest. He fell, gasping, eyes wide in shock. Emma didn't have time to mourn. They had to escape. A race against death. The gunfire had drawn attention. The undead, dozens of them, staggered from alleyways, their empty eyes locking onto the gunfight. Scarface cursed. Shit. We gotta move. His men hesitated, torn between finishing the fight or escaping the horde now closing in. Emma grabbed Riley, hauling her toward the truck. Get in. Lucas leaped into the driver's seat, slamming the door. The truck roared to life. Emma barely made it inside before Lucas floored the gas pedal. The truck sped off, leaving Scarface and his men behind, trapped between the bullets and the undead. Emma watched in the side mirror as the ambushers fired wildly until they were swarmed. Their screams didn't last long. Approaching the stadium, the truck skidded around a corner, barely avoiding an overturned bus. Lucas gripped the wheel. "We good?" Emma checked on Riley, who was breathing heavily, clutching her arm. "She's hurt, but she'll make it." Lucas exhaled. "And Terry?" Silence. They all knew the answer. Emma clenched her fists. "We're almost there." Ahead, the stadium loomed, surrounded by military barricades. Helicopters hovered in the sky. Floodlights lit up the area, and soldiers patrolled the perimeter. For the first time in hours, hope flickered in Emma's chest. Maybe, just maybe, they had found salvation. But as they got closer, they realized something was very, very wrong. The front gates were wide open. Bodies, both soldiers and civilians, were scattered everywhere. And in the middle of it all, the undead waited. The stadium was not a safe haven. It was a trap. The stadium had been their last hope. Now, it was hell on earth. Bodies littered the entrance, some in military uniforms, others in civilian clothes. Blood pooled on the concrete, reflecting the flickering stadium lights. The air reeked of death. And standing in the middle of the carnage, were the undead. They weren't just wandering. They were waiting. Lucas slammed the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop just feet from the entrance. Emma's heart pounded. "It's overrun." Lucas clenched the wheel. "What the hell happened here?" Riley groaned in pain. "What do we do now?" Emma stared at the nightmare ahead. She had no answer. Because there was nowhere left to go. The fall of the stadium. Just hours ago, this place had been a military evacuation zone. Survivors had been promised safety. But something had gone terribly wrong. Gunfire had been exchanged. Maybe it was infected civilians, maybe a single bite had caused chaos. Whatever the reason, the soldiers had failed. And now, instead of a safe zone, the stadium was a feeding ground. Lucas cursed. "We can't stay here." A single moan broke the silence. Then another. Then dozens. The undead turned toward them. One last fight. "Back up! Back up!" Emma shouted. Lucas slammed the truck into reverse, tires screeching. But as they turned to escape, a military Humvee blocked the road. The driver? Undead. The truck crashed into it, jolting everyone inside. Lucas groaned. "We're stuck." The undead from the stadium rushed forward, an unstoppable wave of rotting flesh. Emma grabbed her metal pipe. "Then we fight." Lucas reached for his crowbar. Riley, despite her injury, clenched a broken piece of glass. They had no other choice. The doors burst open, and the survivors charged into the horde. Emma swung her pipe, crushing a skull. Lucas drove his crowbar through another's eye socket. Riley stabbed wildly, screaming in fury. But there were too many. The horde closed in. The helicopter. Just when all seemed lost, a spotlight blinded them. A military helicopter roared overhead, its engines deafening. A soldier leaned out, aiming a machine gun. "Get down!" Emma dropped as bullets tore through the horde, cutting them down like weeds. Lucas grabbed Riley, shielding her. When the gunfire stopped, a rope ladder dropped from the chopper. "Move!" the soldier shouted. Emma didn't hesitate. She grabbed the ladder and climbed for her life. Lucas followed, hauling Riley up with him. The moment they were aboard, the chopper lifted off. The city shrank beneath them. Fires burned. Streets were filled with the undead. There was no life left below. The nightmare wasn't over. But at least, for now, they had survived. The end, or just the beginning. As the helicopter flew away, Emma turned to the soldier. "Where are we going?" The soldier didn't answer right away. His eyes were grim. Then, he finally spoke. "Somewhere safe. I hope." Emma stared out at the dark horizon. Because deep down, she knew the truth. There was no safe place anymore. The world was gone. And this was just the beginning. The end.